Methodology and African Prehistory. Tribes WHO owned the mines, but who like them were annexed as the property of the colonizing countries. Then, after the native tribes, came nations impatient of the yoke, their pulses already beating to the feverish rhythm of liberation struggles. The history of Africa, like the history of mankind as a whole, is really the story of an awakening. The history of Africa needs rewriting, for up till now it has often been masked, faked, distorted, mutilated, by force of circumstance, i.e. through ignorance or self-interest. Crushed by centuries of oppression, Africa has seen generations of travelers, slave traders, explorers, missionaries, governors, and scholars of all kinds give out its image as one of nothing but poverty, barbarism, irresponsibility and chaos. This image has been projected and extrapolated indefinitely in time, as a justification of both the present and the future. It is not our purpose to write a history which will be a mere settling of scores, with colonialist history backfiring on its authors, but rather to change the perspective and revive images which have been forgotten or lost. We must turn once more to science in order to create genuine cultural awareness. We must reconstruct the real course of events. We must find another mode of discourse. If these are the goals and reasons, the why and wherefore, of this enterprise, how to set about it, the methodology, is, as always, the more difficult question. And this is one of the matters to be treated in this first volume of the General History of Africa, compiled under the auspices of UNESCO. Why? This is a scientific undertaking. The shadows and obscurities which still shroud the past of the African continent constitute an irresistible challenge to human curiosity. The history of Africa is practically unknown. Patched-up genealogies, missing dates, structures sketched in a vague and impressionistic manner, or appearing but dimly through a fog, sequences which seem absurd because what goes before them has been destroyed, all these add up to a jerky, incomplete film which reflects only our own ignorance, yet which, with consequences ranging from the irritating to the positively harmful, we have set up as the real history of Africa as it actually happened. Is it surprising, then, that African history should have been accorded such a small and subordinate place in all the histories of mankind and of civilization? But for some decades now, thousands of research workers, some of them of great and even exceptional merit, have been exhuming whole areas of ancient Africa. Every year dozens of new publications appear, expressing a more and more positive attitude. The discoveries about Africa, sometimes spectacular ones, call in question the meaning of certain phases in the history of mankind as a whole. 2. General introduction. But this very proliferation carries with it its own dangers, the risk of contradiction and confusion through lack of coordination, squabbles between schools of opinion which tend to ascribe more importance to the research worker than to the object of his research, and so on. It accordingly seems desirable, for the honor of science, that a survey of unimpeachable quality should be carried out, under the auspices of UNESCO, by teams of scholars both African and non-African, under the authority of an international scientific committee and with African editors, so as to bring the picture up to date. The number and distinction of the research workers who have collaborated in this great new discovery of Africa make it an outstanding experiment in international cooperation. Perhaps more than any other branch of learning, history is a human science. It emerges red-hot from the busy, sometimes tumultuous, forge of the nations. History, fashioned physically by man in the workshop of life itself, constructed mentally by man in laboratories, libraries and on excavation sites, is also made for man, for the people, to illuminate and motivate their awareness. For Africans, the history of Africa is not some narcissistic mirror or a subtle excuse for avoiding the tasks and burdens of today. If it were an alienating device of that kind, the scientific objects of the whole enterprise would be compromised. But is not ignorance of one's OWN past, in other words of a large part of oneself, even more alienating? All the evils that afflict Africa today, as well as all the possibilities for the future, are the result of countless forces transmitted by history. The just as the first step in a rational diagnosis and therapy is the reconstruction of the evolution of a disease, in the same way the first task in any overall analysis of the African continent must be a historical one. Unless one chooses to live in a state of unconsciousness and alienation, one cannot live without memory, or with a memory that belongs to someone else. The end history is the memory of nations. This turning back to oneself can act as a kind of liberating catharsis, like the plunging into one's own depths entailed in psychoanalysis, which, by revealing the basic forces that inhibit our personality, at the same time frees us from the complexes by which our consciousness is held fast in the hidden roots of the subconscious. But if we want to be sure of not exchanging one myth for another, we must see that historical truth, the matrix of an authentic and unalienated consciousness, is strictly tested and substantiated. How? And thus we come to the formidable question of how, or in other words to the problem of methodology. In this connection, as in others, we have to steer the middle course between treating Africa as too exceptional a case on the one hand, and on the other, dealing with it too much in terms proper to other parts of the world. Some 3. Methodology and African prehistory. People say that before we can talk of the real history of Africa we should wait to find the same kinds of evidence as in Europe, the same array of written or epigraphic documents. In short, for them, the problems of the historian are the same everywhere, in the tropics as at the poles. It must be clearly reaffirmed in this connection that there is no question of gagging reason on the pretext that there is a lack of material to present to it. Reason does not become something different because it is exercised in the tropics. Reason is supreme and does not bow to geography. But precisely because reason is not blind, it has, in order to keep an accurate and firm grip on things, to apprehend different realities differently. So the principles of internal and external criticism have to be applied according to a different mental strategy when one is considering, on the one hand, the epic song Samedi F1 and, on the other, the capitulary detail for the circulars Napoleon sent to his prefects. The methods and techniques have to be different. This strategy will not be the same for every part of Africa. The Nile Valley and the Mediterranean shores of the continent have, as far as historical reconstruction is concerned, more in common with Europe than has Africa south of the Sahara. In fact, the difficulties specific to the history of Africa can already be seen when one looks at the facts of the physical geography of the continent. Africa, a lonely continent if ever there was one, seems to turn its back on the rest of the Old World, to which it is joined only by the fragile umbilical cord of the Isthmus of Suez. It is to the south, amid the austral waters, that Africa thrusts her solid mass, bounded by coastal ranges through which rivers force their way by means of heroic defile, in themselves great obstacles to penetration. The only sizable passage between the Sahara and the Abyssinian mountains is blocked by the vast marshes of the Bahr el Ghazal. Strong winds and sea currents guard the coast from Cape Blanco to Cape Verde, while in the middle of the continent 3 deserts had internal barriers to isolation from without: in the south, the Kalahari; in the center, the green desert of the equatorial forest with all its dangers which MN had to overcome before he could make it his refuge; and in the north, the Sahara, desert of deserts, a huge continental filter, the wild sea of ergs and regs which joins with the mountain fringe of the Atlas to separate the log of the Mediterranean part of Africa from that of the rest of the continent. These ecological forces, though not forming completely watertight compartments, have, especially in prehistory, weighed heavily on every aspect of Africa's destiny. They have also enhanced the value of all the natural loopholes which were from the start to act as gangways or corridors in the exploration of Africa, begun thousands of millennia ago. One paramount example is the great north-south groove of the Rift Valley, stretching from the very center of Africa and across the Ethiopian ridge as far as Iraq. In the east-west direction the valleys of the Songhai, Ubangi and Zaire must also have, by in the Malinke tongue, praise to Samedi. Samedi, the founder of the Mali Empire in the 13th century, is one of the most popular heroes in African history. For general introduction, acted as a corridor. It is not by chance that the first kingdoms of Black Africa developed in those more accessible regions, the Sahels, to at once permeable from within, to a certain extent open towards the exterior, and in contact with neighboring regions of Africa with different and complementary resources. These open areas, with their comparatively rapid evolution, afford, the contrario, the proof that isolation was one of the key factors in Africa's slowness in pursuit of certain kinds of progress. 3. As Fernand Braudel wrote, civilizations are made on earth, and he adds, civilization is the daughter of number. The very vastness of the African continent, with a diluted and therefore readily itinerant population living in a nature at once generous with its fruits and minerals, but cruel with its endemic and epidemic diseases, for prevented it from reaching the threshold of demographic concentration which has almost always been one of the preconditions of major qualitative changes in the social, political and economic spheres. Moreover, the slave trade was a severe demographic drain from time immemorial, and especially from the 15th to the 20th century, after the traffic was organized on a large scale, and this can only have helped to deprive Africa of the stability and human dynamism necessary for any outstanding creativeness. Even on the technological plane, neither nature nor man, geography nor history, have been kind to Africa. And it is indispensable that we should go back to these fundamental conditions of the evolutionary process in order to pose the problems in objective terms, and not in the form of such myths as racial inferiority, congenital tribalism and the so-called historical passivity of the Africans. The best these subjective and irrational approaches can do is conceal a deliberate ignorance. As for the worst, the less said the better. The difficulty of sources. It must be admitted that as far as Africa is concerned the question of sources is a difficult one. There are three main sources for our historical knowledge of Africa: written documents, archaeology and oral tradition. These are backed up by linguistics and anthropology, which enable us to elaborate and refine the interpretation of data which may otherwise be crude and unyielding. It would be wrong, however, to place these different sources in any preordained and rigid order of importance. Written sources, if not very rare, are at least unevenly distributed in time and space. The most obscure centuries in African history are those which lack the clear and precise illumination that comes from written. 2. From the Arabic folly. Shore. Here shore of the desert regarded as a sea. 3. The climatic factors should not be neglected. Professor Thurston Shaw has stressed the fact that it has not been possible to grow certain cereals adapted to a Mediterranean climate rain in winter in the Niger Valley because south of 18 N, owing to the blocking of the intertropical front, they cannot be acclimatized. C.C. T. Shaw, 1971b, pages 143-53. 4. C.J. Ford, 1971. 5. Methodology and African Prehistory. Accounts, for example, the centuries preceding and following the birth of Christ. Here North Africa is an exception. But even when such evidence exists, its interpretation is strewn with difficulties and ambiguities. Thus, on re-examining the travels of Ibn Battuta, and the various ways in which he and Al-Umari transcribed place names, some historians have come to question whether Niamey on the Sankirini was the capital of ancient Mali. 5. And the quantitative plane, large masses of written material, archival or narrative, have still not yet been exploited, as is shown by recent incomplete inventories of unpublished manuscripts concerning the history of Black Africa which are being found not only in libraries in Morocco, Algeria and Europe, but also in the libraries of Sudanese scholars and leading citizens in towns throughout the Niger Bend, 7 and whose titles suggest some promising new veins. UNESCO has established the Ahmed Baba Center at Timbuktu to promote the collection of such material. The archives of Iran, Iraq, Armenia, India and China, not to mention the Americas, must hold many scraps of African history awaiting some perspicacious and imaginative researcher. For instance, in the archives of the Prime Minister in Istanbul, where the records of the decrees of the Imperial Ottoman Divan are kept and classified, there came to light an unpublished correspondence, dated MY 1577, from Sultan Murad II to my Idris Alama and the Bey of Tunis. This correspondence throws quite a new light on the diplomacy of Kanem Bornu at that period, and on the situation in the Fezzan state in the African countries deeply influenced by Islamic culture. Institutes of African Studies and Centers for Historical Research pursued an active policy in search of manuscripts. NEW guides, such as those published by the International Council on Archives under the auspices of UNESCO, help to guide researchers through the forest of documents scattered throughout the West. Only a determined policy of publishing and judicious reprinting, together with translation and distribution in Africa, can bring all these new efforts together and give them a multiplier effect strong enough to enable us to cross a critical new qualitative threshold in the vision of Africa's past. And the new attitude to the new mass of documents will be almost as important in this as the new documents themselves. MENY texts which have been in use since the 19th century or the colonial era call imperatively for a re-examination free of anachronistic prejudice, and imbued instead with an endogenic approach. In this connection, written sources based on sub-Saharan scripts via idiomas should not be neglected. The silent witnesses revealed by archaeology are often more eloquent than the official chroniclers. The marvelous discoveries of archaeology have 5. C.J. Wick, 1973. The author risks using the argument of silentio. If Ibn Battuta had crossed the Niger or the Senegal he would have said so. 6. C. UNESCO, 1973, Doc. Note. SHC/WS/294. 7. C. Etudes Moyennes, ISHM, number September 3, 1972. 8. CBG. Martin, 1969, pages 15 to 27. 6. General introduction already served African history well, especially when, as is the case with several thousand millennia of Africa's past, there is no oral or written chronicle available. Then objects alone, buried with those for whom they bear witness, keep vigil beneath the heavy shroud of the earth over a past without a face and without a voice. Some of these objects are particularly significant as points of reference in the measuring of civilization. These include articles made of iron, together with the technology involved, pottery and its inscriptions, production techniques and styles, objects made of glass, and different graphic styles, the techniques of canoeing, fishing and weaving, foodstuffs, and geomorphological, hydraulic and ecological structures linked to the evolution of climate. The language of archaeological excavation has by nature something objective and irrefutable about it. Thus the study of the typology of the pottery and objects of bone and metal found in Tunisia, Chad and Sahara demonstrates the link between the pre-Islamic peoples south of the Chad Basin and cultural areas extending as far as the Nile and the Libyan desert. The living ties of the past are revived, beyond the modern landscape with its crushing loneliness and apathy, by the kinship shown in statuettes of baked clay wearing cross belts, in the decorations on the bodies of figurines, in the shapes of jars and bracelets, harpoons and bones, in arrowheads or tips, and in throwing knives. 90 Location, classification and protection of archaeological sites in Africa is a matter of prime urgency and importance, which must be undertaken before thieves, irresponsible amateurs or ignorant tourists despoil and disturb them and strip them of any serious historical interest. But such urgent large-scale exploitation of these sites is only possible within a framework of inter-African programs, backed up by powerful international cooperation. 3. Besides the first two sources of African history, written documents and archaeology, oral tradition takes its place as a real living museum, conserver and transmitter of the social and cultural creations stored up by peoples said to have no written records. This spoken history is a very frail thread by which to trace our way back through the dark twists of the labyrinth of time. Those who are its custodians are hoary-headed old men with cracked voices, memories often dim, and a stickler's insistence on etiquette violus oblige, as behoves potential ancestors. They are like the last remaining islets in a landscape that was once imposing and coherent, but which is now eroded, flattened and thrown into disorder by the sharp waves of modernism. Latter-day fossils. Whenever one of them dies, a fiber of Ariadne's thread is broken, a fragment of the landscape literally disappears underground. Yet oral tradition is by far the most intimate of historical sources, the most rich, the one which is fullest of the sap of authenticity. As an African proverb has it, the mouth of an old man smells bad, but it says good and salutary things. However useful the written record may be, it is bound to freeze, to dry up its. 9. C.P. Howard, 1969. 7. Methodology and African Prehistory. Subject. It decants, dissects, schematizes, petrifies, the letter kill. Tradition clothes things in flesh and blood and color, it gives blood to the skeleton of the past. It presents in 3 dimensions what is often crowded onto the 2-dimensional surface of a piece of paper. The joy of Sanjida's mother, overwhelmed by the sudden recovery of her son, still bursts forth in the warm and epic tones of the griots of Mali. So of course, we have to skirt many pitfalls in order to winnow the material offered by oral tradition, to separate the wheat of fact from the chaff of words that are only there for the sake of symmetry or polish, and of set phrases that are only the formal wrapping of a message from the distant past. It has been said that oral tradition does not inspire confidence because it is functional, as if every human message were not by definition functional, including archetypes, which by their very passiveness, and beneath an appearance of neutrality and objectivity, conceal so many lies by omission, and clothe error in respectability. It is true that the epic tradition in particular is a paramythical recreation of the past, the sort of psychodrama revealing to a community its roots and the corpus of values which nourish its personality, the magic passport enabling it to travel back up the river of time to the realm of its ancestors. That is why epic and historical utterance are not exactly the same. The HE first overlaps the second, with anachronistic projection forward and backward in real time, and with concertina effects like those found in the earth in archaeology. But do not written records suffer from these enigmatic intrusions too? Here as elsewhere we must seek the nugget of sense, try to find the equivalent of a touchstone which identifies pure metal and rejects slag and dross. So of course, in epic the weakness of the chronological sequence is the Achilles heel. Mixed up temporal sequences cause the image of the past to reach us, not clear and stable as in the mirror, but like a fleeting, broken up reflection on the surface of a ruffled stream. The average length of reigns and generations is a highly controversial question, and extrapolations based on recent periods have to be accepted with great reserve, because of demographic and political changes, to name only two factors. Sometimes an exceptional and magnetic dynast polarizes the exploits of his predecessors and successors around his own person, and the others are literally eclipsed. This applies to certain dynasts in Rwanda, or to the Amanzan, king of Sego beginning of the 19th century to Whom the Griots attribute all that kingdom's major conquests. Furthermore, an oral account taken out of its context is like a fish out of water, it dies. Taken in isolation, oral tradition resembles African masks wrested from the communion of the faithful and exhibited to the curiosity of the uninitiated. It loses its significance and life. Yet it is through that life, because it is always being taken over by fresh witnesses charged with transmitting it, that oral tradition adapts itself to the expectations of new audiences, and this adaptation relates mainly to the presentation, though it does not always leave the content intact. Moreover, some modern sharks and 8. General introduction. Mercenaries of oral tradition even serve up rehashes of written texts which they inject into the oral one. Even the content of the message is often hermetic or esoteric. For the African, speech is a weighty matter, an ambiguous force which can make and unmake, which can be the bearer of evil. That is why the message is not articulated openly and directly, but wrapped up in fable, allusion, hint, proverbs that are hard to understand for the vulgar but clear for those who possess the antennæ of wisdom. In Africa, speech is too weighty to be wasted, and the more authoritative one's position the less one speaks in public. But if someone says to another, "You have eaten the toad and spat on its head," he understands at once he is being accused of avoiding part of his responsibilities. Degrees. The hermeticism of this half-speech shows at once the inestimable value of oral tradition, and its limits. It is almost impossible to transfer all its richness from one language to another, especially when that other is structurally and sociologically very remote. Tradition does not stand up well to translation. When uprooted it loses its vigor and authenticity, for language is the home of being. And many errors ascribed to tradition itself are due to incompetent or unscrupulous interpreters. Be that as it may, the validity of oral tradition has today been amply proved, and confirmed by cross-checking with written and archaeological sources, as in the cases of the Cowby Salé site, the Lake Kinsale remains and the events of the 16th century as transmitted by the Shono, which D. P. Abraham has observed to be in agreement with the writings of Portuguese travelers of the period. To sum up, the mode of discourse of oral tradition, whether in epic or prose, whether didactic or ethical, has a triple point of view. First, it reveals the values and usages which motivate the people and condition their future acts through representation of archetypes from the past. In doing this, it not only reflects but also creates history. Amanzan is addressed as Master of Waters and Master of Men. This signifies the absoluteness of his power. But the same stories also showed him constantly consulting his warriors, his griots and his wife's. 11. A sense of honor and reputation is unmistakable in the famous line in the Song of the Bow in honor of Samedi Ephesus Iakaeus Melody. 12. The same idea is also beautifully expressed in the story of Bakari Dian's struggle against the Fulani of Cornary. The valiant Bakari Dian has retired in anger to his village, Dong Larongo, and the people come to beg him to return to the head of the Sidao army. He gives way finally. Then they touch the sensitive chord of pride and glory. Forget old words exchanged. It is your present name you must think of. For one comes into the world to make a name. If you are born, grow up and die without a name, you have come into the world for nothing, and you have left it for nothing. Then he cries, Riots of Sigao. Io. Ch. Aguc, 1972. Then. Cl. Castello, 1978. 12. Death is better than dishonor. 9. Methodology and African prehistory. Since you have come, it is not impossible. I will do what you ask, for the sake of my fame. I will not do it for Amonson. I will do it for no one in Siao. I will do it just for for reputation. Even after my death, it will be added to my name. Similarly, the piece of evidence about both civilization and law, Philomaket says, you are fortunate that I am forbidden to kill messengers. But the reconstruction of the past is by no means wholly fictional. There are passages of recollection, veins of history which are often more prosaic than the vivid decorations of the epic imagination. Thus began this institution of collective herding in Bambara towns. If you were chosen and made a herdsman, you became a public fula. The public Fulani kept the flocks of the king. They were and of different races, and their chief shepherd was called Bonki. Again, at that time people did not wear slippers, but leather samras of tanned ox hide, with a strap round the nose, the big toe, and a strap round the heel. The epic is strewn with allusions to techniques, and to objects which are not essential to the action but suggest the setting. The Amonson sent for his 60 Simono paddlers, 30 men at the prow and 30 at the stern. The canoe was richly decorated. Ladders were got ready and set against the wall. The Go infantry attacked and infiltrated the town. The Go horsemen launched flaming arrows. The houses of the village caught light. Saran, the WOMBN in love with the Amonson, goes and wets the court warrior's gunpowder. It is only through a careful analysis, sometimes even psychoanalysis, of the very psychoses of the transmitters of the tradition, and of their audience, that the historian can get to the solid substance of historical reality. The number of different versions transmitted by rival groups, for example, by the various griot clients of each noble protector Koran, deity far from being a handicap, is on the contrary only a further guarantee for critical history. WHEN accounts agree, as in the case of the Bambara and Fula griots, who belong to opposing camps, the authenticity of the evidence is reinforced. And as is shown in the case of the Guru, with WHOM the liberal and integrationist exoteric tradition, transmitted by the lineage, coexists with the oligarchical and hair-splitting esoteric tradition of the secret society. Spoken history contains self-censoring elements because of its very different origins. In fact, it is not private property, but a COMMON fund which derives from and provides for various groups in the community. The important thing is that internal criticism of these records should be supported by a thorough knowledge of the genre in question, its themes and techniques, its codes and stereotypes, its set phrases of putting, the conventional digressions, the evolution of the language, the audience and what it expected of the storytellers. Above all, the historian must know about the caste to which these latter belong, their rules of life, how they were brought up, their ideals, their schools. We note that in Mali and Guinea, for example, there have for centuries been real schools of initiation at Kiola, Kita, Nyagasola, Naini, and so on. 10. General Introduction. This rigid, formal and institutional oral tradition usually has its structure reinforced and supported by court music, which is integral to it and underlines its didactic and artistic portions. Some of the instruments used, such as the salsobela, the balafon of Sumero Kanti, are so old that they would repay an archaeological investigation in themselves. But the correspondences between types of instrument and music, types of song and dance, make up a minutely ordered world, in which anomalies and later additions are easily detected. Every genre has its own special instrument in each cultural region, the bala xylophone or the ball harp lute for epic, the bandrit a big round one-sided drum made out of a gourd and beaten with the bare hands of the bossy for the exaltation often silent of the Zarbian bombs. Deep air of the kings, the amrit harp zither for the tropical mead-a-loan of the fang poet musicians. These instruments, the vehicles of spoken history, are sacred, the object of veneration. In effect they are part of the artist, and their importance in communicating the message is all the greater since, because language is tonal, music has direct meaning, the instrument becomes the artist's voice, and he does not need to utter the word. The triple rhythm of tone, intensity and duration becomes music with meaning, the kind of semantic melodism Marcel Jousse spoke of. As a matter of fact, music is so much a part of oral tradition that some stories can only be told in song. Popular song, which epitomizes the will of the people in a satirical form, sometimes spiced with black humor, which still retains its vitality even in the present age with its election campaigns, is a valuable genre, complementing and counterbalancing the evidence of official records. What has been said here of music applies equally to the other modes of expression, such as the visual arts. In the bas-reliefs of the kingdoms of Abomey and Benin or in Cuba sculpture, we sometimes find a direct expression of historical characters, cultures and events. So oral tradition is not just a second-best source to be resorted to only when there is nothing else. It is a distinct source in itself, with a now well-established methodology, and it lends the history of the African continent a marked originality. For in linguistics, African history has not an auxiliary science but an independent discipline which nevertheless leads history right to the heart of its own subject. A good counter-demonstration of this is Nubia, buried in the double silence of the ruins of Meroe and of the undeciphered Meroitic script just because the language remains unknown. 1-3 True, much still remains to be done in this field, and what needs doing first is to define scientifically the languages concerned. The descriptive approach must not be sacrificed to a comparative and synthetic one which aims at being typological and genetic. It is only through minute and laborious analysis of the facts of language, with its significance of consonants, vowels and 13. UNESCO organized an international scientific symposium in Cairo in 1974 on the deciphering of this African language. Methodology and African prehistory. Tones, its wide-ranging diversity of combinations in syntagmatic schema and its signification in the living experience of the speakers of a given community. 14 That one can extrapolate backwards, an operation often made difficult by a lack of historical depth in knowledge of the languages concerned. In fact, the only way they can be compared in terms of their contemporary strata is by the synchronic method, which is the indispensable foundation of any diachronic and genetic synthesis. It is a difficult task, and one can easily see why learned battle rages in certain areas, particularly over Bantu. Malcolm Guthrie supports the theory of autogenesis. Joseph Greenberg puts up a spirited defense of the idea that the Bantu languages need to be placed in a wider, continental context. This, he says, because of resemblances which are not accidental analogies due to external influence, but derived from an intrinsic genetic kinship, manifested in similarities in pronouns, basic vocabulary, and grammatical characteristics such as the system of noun classification, in hundreds of languages from Wolof to Baka Republic of the Sudan. These arguments are not just academic debates as far as the historian is concerned. Anyone who takes, for example, the distribution of groups of analogous words denoting sheep on the edge of the forests in Central Africa, notices that these homogeneous groups do not overlap the edge of the forest, but divide parallel to it. This suggests that the livestock in question spread along the parallels of the two adjoining biotopes of savanna and forest, whereas farther east the linguistic pattern forms vertical belts from east to southern Africa, which suggests introduction at right angles to the parallels of latitude, and illustrates, the contrario, the inhibiting role of the forest in the transfer of techniques. 1-5 But this role was not the same in the case of all techniques. In short, linguistic studies show that the routes and paths of migration, and the diffusion of both material and spiritual cultures, are marked out by the diffusion of related words. Hence the importance of diachronic linguistic analysis and glottochronology to the historian who wishes to understand the meaning and dynamics of Africa's evolution. For instance, Greenberg has shown Canari's contribution to Hausa as regards cultural terms and terms of military technique, and this brings out the influence of the Bornu Empire in the development of the Hausa kingdoms. In particular, the titles or styles of the Bornu dynasties, including Canary terms such as Kadamar, Mitra, etc., spread far into Cameroon and Nigeria. The systematic study of toponyms and anthroponyms can also produce very accurate indications, on condition that the nomenclature is revised according to the endogenic approach. For a large number of names have been distorted by the exotic pronunciation or transcription of non-Africans, or by Africans acting as interpreters or scribes. The hunt for the MOT just, even and especially when it has been institutionalized in writing. 14. cm. Howies, 1971, page 45. 15. C.C. Arat, 1968. 12. General Introduction. For centuries, is one of the most complex tasks to be accomplished by a critical history of Africa. Let us take an example. The word Chayaga, used by the old Afrikaners to denote the kingdom of the Sudan, has often been assimilated with the word Gao. But if the word Chayaga is analyzed on the basis of Teta and Kanuri, the kingdom of that name can also be identified between Wada-e-Namina Darfur Sudan and Ferdit Central African Republic. 16. The question of references to the YMBN as the land of origin of numerous Sudanese dynasties has been re-examined in some depth since the time of H.R. Palmer. Should not the word YMBN be interpreted not in the sense of the pious avocations of Muslim chroniclers oriented towards Arabia Felix, but rather as referring to the ancient land of Ym whence he met? 7. An examination of the Swahili lexicon, full of terms of Arabic origin, and of those of the peoples living along the east coast of Madagascar and Moro, and Talaotra, Anozi also furnishes the historian with a mine of information. At any rate, linguistics, which has already done African history good service, should discard from the outset the disparaging ethnocentric attitude which characterized the African linguistics of A.W. Schlegel and Augusta Schleicher. According to them, the languages of the Indo-European family are at the summit of evolution, and the languages of the blacks are at the very bottom of the ladder, though it used to be thought that they were interesting in that they revealed a state near to the original state of language, when languages were supposed to be without grammar, speech just a series of monosyllables, and vocabulary restricted to an elementary inventory. 18.5 The same remark applies a fortiori to anthropology and ethnology. Ethnological discourse 19 has by the force of circumstance been a discourse with explicitly discriminatory premises, and conclusions implicitly political, with, between the two, a scientific exercise which was necessarily ambiguous. Its main presupposition was often linear evolution, with Europe, pioneer of civilization, in the van of human advance, and at the rear the primitive tribes of Oceania, Amazonia and Africa. It asked the question, what on earth was it like to be an Indian, a black, a Papuan, an Arab? The other, whether backward, barbarous, savage to a greater or lesser degree, is always different, and for this reason he is an object of interest to the scientist or an object of greed to the slaver. So ethnology was deputed to serve as a sort of ministry of European curiosity vis the natives. The ethnological outlook, strong on nakedness, misery and folklore, was often sadistic, ludicrous and at best paternalistic. Ethnological Essays and Reports. 16. C. Peacock, 1972, pages 529-48. 17. C. A. Mohamedou, 1971. 18. C. M. Howies, 1971, page 27. 19. The term ethnic group has always been marked by radical prejudice, since from the first it was applied to peoples supposed to possess no writing. Even in the 16th century, Clement Marot used the phrase idolatrous or ethnic. Ethnography is the descriptive assembly of material, ethnology, the comparative synthesis. 13. Methodology and African prehistory. Usually sought to justify the status quo and contributed to the development of underdevelopment. 20. Evolutionism de la Darwin, despite its other virtues, the one-way diffusionism which has too often regarded Africa as the passive outlet of inventions from elsewhere, or the functionalism of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, which denied primitive societies any historical dimension, all these schools of thought were naturally adapted to the colonial situation, on which propitious soil they duly proliferated. 21. Their approaches, which in fact contributed little to the understanding of exotic societies, were invalidated still further by the fact that they concentrated precisely on those societies which were strangest to them, prototypes of humanity at an elementary stage. But the societies they selected were merely microorganisms. They had an historical role that was not negligible, that was sometimes even remarkable, but it was usually marginal to the more powerful socio-political ensembles which more deeply influenced the course of history. Thus the whole of Africa was presented in images which Africans themselves might regard as strange, just as if, at the beginning of this century, Europe was personified by the housing conditions, table manners or technical level of the communities of central Brittany, Cantal or Sardinia. Moreover, the ethnological method based on individual inquiry bearing the stamp of subjective experience, total because it was intensive, but total only at the microcosmic level, led to objective conclusions which proved very fragile as soon as they were used for extrapolation. Lastly, by an implacable dialectic, the very object or other of ethnology gradually disappeared under the influence of colonialism. The primitive natives who lived by hunting and gathering, if not by cannibalism, were transformed into subproletariats of peripheral centers in a world system of production which had its pole of attraction in the northern hemisphere. The colonial system consumed and annihilated its own object, which is why those who had been cast in a role of objects, in this case the Africans, decided to initiate an independent mode of discourse of their own, as subjects of history, daring even to assert that in certain respects, the most primitive people are not those who are described as such. At the same time, those who had worked without any preconceived ideas to find original structures in, and a historical thread leading through, African societies, whether political states or not, pioneers such as Frodenus, Delafosse, Palmer and Evans Pritchard, continued their efforts, which have been 20. C. J. Copens and M. Godelier, 1971, page 45. Colonial ideology and ethnology form part of one and the same configuration, and between the two orders of phenomena there is an interaction which determines the development of both. 21. C. J. Ruffle, 1977a, page 429, Lee Pseudo-Darwinism culturel qui inspire la pensée anthropologique du Legitimely colonialism qui northeast serait pas les produit d'une certaine conjoncture politique, mais qui la white d'une structure biologique, then ça manque particulier de la competition naturelle. L'anthropologie du XX d'un bon conscience Euro-imperialist. 14. General Introduction. Refined and carried further by more recent research workers. This group believes that by using the intellectual tools proper to the human sciences in general, and adapting them to Africa, objective results may be achieved. They must demolish faulty approaches based either on a supposed material and congenital difference between natives and others, or on the idea that the former occupy a primitive stage on the path of civilization. All that is necessary is to admit that while the being of Africans is the same, that of Homo sapiens, their being in the world is different. Once this is done, new instruments can be developed with which to apprehend their particular evolution. At the same time the Marxist approach, so long as it is not dogmatic, and the structuralist approach of Levi-Strauss also contribute useful if contrasted views on the evolution of peoples reputed to be without writing. The Marxist method, which is essentially historical and for which history is the collective consciousness in action, plays greater emphasis on productive forces and production relations, on praxis and norms, while the structuralist method aims at unveiling the unconscious but logical mechanisms and coherent ensembles which frame and underlie the actions of minds and of societies. W.M. White hope that anthropology, drawing from these new sources, will be something more than a phoenix risen in response to new needs from the ashes of a certain type of ethnology. 22. But anthropology will only escape by key contradictions which discredited functionalist ethnology if, through the diachronic approach, it includes the temporal dimension, for today's structures are meaningless if they are related only to the point of contemporaneity, which must be integrated with the vector arising in the past and already pointing towards the future. The end. If it is to be useful to history, anthropology must avoid theoretical reconstructions in which ideology outweighs concrete facts, like an apoplectic head on an anemic body. Such constructions only produce the pseudo-history so hated by the functionalists. light can be thrown on the historical process only by using structures comparable to the theoretical schema of evolution. The study of recurrent structural phenomena, genealogies, dynastic lists, age groups, and so on in terms of social conceptions of the group, can lead to specially new and fruitful analyses. Anthropology ought to criticize its own procedures, insist on norms as much as on practices, and not confuse social relations, traceable to experience, with the structures which underlie them. This will result in the mutual enrichment of norms, structures and opinions by making extensive use of quantitative and collective techniques of inquiry and by adopting the rational, subjective mode of discourse. Anthropology is concerned not only 22. Sociology would thus be an intersocial science for the modern world, while anthropology would represent the comparativist intersocietal approach. But this would be tantamount to reviving the highly questionable categories born of the scission between them: ethnohistory, ethnobotany, and so on. Indeed, why not ethnoarchaeology, ethnoanatomy, and even ethnomathematics? 15. Methodology and African prehistory. With the interactions of general factors, but also with the historical synthesis. For example, there seems to be a correlation between, on the one hand, the existence of trade routes where certain commodities are a royal monopoly and, on the other hand, centralized political forms in early Ghana and Mali, in the 18th century Asante Empire, in the Lunda Kingdom of Zaire, and so on, whereas, significantly, unlike the Njan and Zulu, peoples like the Nyakusa and Kosai, with the same language and customs but off such routes, did not reach a monarchical stage. 23. From this one might try to infer a sort of law of anthropology, or political sociology. Kinship structures can also have a great effect on historical evolution. For instance, when two groups that speak different languages meet, the form of conjugal union between the groups usually determines which language shall predominate. The maternal tongue only prevails if women are taken as wives, not slaves or concubines. So some Nguni groups preserved their original language, while others, who took Sotho wives, lost their own language and were taken over by the Sotho. This has also happened with the Fula shepherds from Marina and Fura who took Mandingo wives and founded the province of Washulu. All they retain of their Fula origin is the name and certain physical traits. They have lost their original language and speak Malinke or Bambara instead. So the main sources of African history, as outlined above, cannot be arranged a priori according to a scale of values which makes some permanently more important than others. Each case must be judged in itself. It is not really a question of radically differing kinds of evidence. All can be defined as indications which come to us from the past, and which, as the vehicles of messages which are not entirely neutral and objective, contain intentions either open or concealed. So all call for methodological criticism, and each, according to the circumstances, occupy a predominant position. Each lead to other kinds of sources. Oral tradition, for example, has often led to archaeological sites, and may even help to place written evidence in perspective. Thus the great Ibn Khaldun writes of Sanjida in his History of the Berbers. He was succeeded by his son Mansa Ulai. Mansi in their tongue signifies sultan, and Ulai is the equivalent of Arli. Yet every storyteller still explains that Mansa Ulai means the king with a fair skin. Principles of research. For main principles must govern research if we want to push forward to a new frontier in African historiography. Begin with interdisciplinarity. This is so important that it can almost, in itself, be regarded as a source. The application of socio-political anthropology to the oral tradition from the kingdom of Sigao, for example, has considerably filled out a picture which would otherwise be nothing but a 23. C.L. Thompson, 1969, pages 72 to 3. 16. General Introduction. Bare genealogical tree debt with a few stereotypical beads, so that the complexity and the interpenetration of structures sometimes modeled on ancient hegemonies, for example, Mali, emerge in all their vivid concreteness. Similarly, in the case of the countries of the Niger Delta, oral tradition shows that development was not solely due to the influence of the slave and palm oil trades, but was also determined by previous endogenic relations in the north-south and east-west directions, reaching as far as Lagos and the Ijebu country, backing up and greatly enriching in this respect the illusions of Pacheco Prera in the Esmeralda. 24 AD. Was it not a datum of cultural anthropology, the initiatory text of the Fula shepherds? 25, which enabled prehistorians to unravel the enigmas of the taxilized frescoes, such as the legless animals in the picture called the Odex and the Hydra, the magic LP of Durbaon, and so on. Thus it is that, after an interval of years, rituals still performed today enable us to identify the 5 marvelous dancers in the Jandaran frescoes as the 5 mythical sisters of the 7 sons of Caligula. The expansion of the bandit, as attested by the concordant sources of linguistics, oral tradition, archaeology, anthropology, and the early written sources, Arab, Portuguese, British and Afrikaner, becomes a living reality which can be set out in a vivid synthesis. Similarly, while linguistic arguments converge with those of technology to suggest that royal gongs and twin bells spread from West Africa to Lower Zaire, Shab and Zambia, archaeological evidence would of course provide invaluable confirmation of this. Such combination of sources becomes all the more imperative when it comes to reducing the difficulties of chronology. Carbon-14 datings are not always to be had, and when they are they need to be interpreted and compared with other evidence from, say, metallurgy or pottery, both materials and styles. Nor do we always have, as in the north of Chad, 6 vast quantities of pottery fragments, on the basis of which we can build up a typology representing a chronological scale of 6 levels. An excellent example of the coming together of all available sources is Enedi, where it has been possible to establish a diachronic typology of pictorial and ceramic styles and to draw from them a chronological series extending over 8 millennia, and all this supported by stratigraphy excavation, and confirmed by carbon datings and by the study of the flora and fauna, the habitat, and oral tradition. 27 MPS of the eclipses which are known to have been visible in specific areas at specific times can provide remarkable dating evidence when such eclipses can be identified with particular reigns in dynastic traditions. But, in general, chronology requires the use of several sources, for a variety of reasons. First, the average length of reigns and generations varies. 24. C.E.J. Aligo, 1973. 25. C. A. Hampe Bob and G. Dieterlin, 1961. 26. C. Y. Coppens, I. 960, pages I-29 ff. 27. A. Bayloud, 1966, pages 3 IFF. 17. Methodology and African Prehistory. Secondly, the nature of the relationship between the sovereign and his successor is not always clear. Thirdly, the meaning of the word son is sometimes sociological rather than biological. Fourthly, one king sometimes has as many as 3 or 4 strong names. Lastly, as in the case of the Bemb, the list of chiefs sometimes merges with that of the list of candidates to the chieftainship. Without wishing to minimize the importance of chronology, which is the very spine of history, and without ceasing our attempts to base chronology on solid foundations, we must resist the psychosis of precision at any price, which is in any case a chimera. Why should we be so eager to say Kaubi Saleh fell in the year 1086, instead of just saying the end of the 11th century? And not all dates are equally important. The degree of accuracy required varies. They do not all need to be placed on a pedestal. On the other hand, it is very important that the whole course of the historical process should be reintegrated into the context of African time. This latter is not resistant to the ordering of narrative data into a sequence of facts which create one another by means of antecedents and causality. The African's idea of time is based on the principle of causality. But this is a causality applied according to particular norms, in which logic is steeped in and diverted by myth, in which the economic stage reached is elementary, and time is not money, so that there is no need for it to be measured numerically, in which the rhythm of works and days is metronome enough for human activity, in which calendars are not abstract or universal, but deal in natural phenomena such as moon and sun, rain and drought, and the movement of men and beasts. Every hour is defined by concrete acts. Thus, in Burundi, Amakana is the time to milk 7 a.m. Machirika is when the herds are let out 8 a.m. Kwaisas is when the sun spreads out 9 a.m. Kumusas is when the sun spreads out over the hills 10 a.m. and so on. In this cattle-raising country, time is measured in terms of pastoral and agricultural life. Elsewhere, Children's names are derived from the day they were born and events that preceded or followed. In North Africa, for example, Muslims are apt to call their children after the month of their birth, Ramadana, Shabana, Milad. Despite the dross of myth, tales and legends are an attempt to apprehend rationally the process of social development. And it is since that time that beasts were raised at home that there were smiths, that women began to do such work. That is the moral of history. This conception of time is historical in several respects. In gerontocratic African societies the idea of anteriority is even more significant than elsewhere, because upon it alone are based such rights as speaking in public, participation in special dances and certain dishes, marriage, the respect of other people, and so on. Primogeniture is not usually a matter of exclusive right to royal succession, and the number of those with potential claims, uncles, brothers, sons, is always high. The fact that age is taken into account in the context of a very open competition again lends significance to chronology. But there is no need to know that one was 18. General introduction: born in exactly such and such a year. The main thing is just to prove one was born before such and such another person. References to absolute chronology are indispensable only in much larger and more anonymous societies. This conception of social time is not static. In the context of the African pan-dynamist philosophy of the universe, one should always be adding to one's vital force, which is eminently social and includes the idea of progress in and through the community. As Bakari Diane says, even after my death, it will be added to MYMAMD. In certain languages the same word banya in Bambara, for example, denotes a material gift, honor and growth. The reckoning of the seasons is often based on astronomical observation of one series of constellations, such as the Great Bear, the MOMG, the KOMO of Upper Zaire, the Pleiades, which they compare to a basket of matches, signal that it is time to sharpen the knives and clear the fields. If necessary, this conception of time can be made more mathematical. Examples include notches in special bits of wood kept as archives in the Dogon caves, the putting of a gold nugget each year into a receptacle in the stool house of the kings of Bonomansu, or of a pebble into a receptacle in the king's hut in Andain country, not to mention the great achievements in this respect in Pharaonic Egypt and Muslim kingdoms such as that of the Almohads. If one thinks of the difficulty of converting the series of rains into a series of dates, and the need to find a fixed point of reference, it is clear that the latter is usually provided by some dated external event, for example, the attack on Bonomansu. The use of writing, the spread of universalist religions with calendars depending on a precise terminus, a quote, and Africa's entry into the world of profit and the accumulation of wealth, have remodeled the traditional conception of time. But in its day it corresponded to the needs of the societies concerned. Another imperative requirement is that African history must at last be seen from within, not still measured by the yardstick of alien values. There cannot be an independent collective personality without an awareness of self and the right to be different. So of course, the policy and practice of self-examination do not consist in artificially abolishing Africa's historical connections with the other continents of the Old and New worlds. But these connections have to be analyzed in terms of mutual exchanges and multilateral influences, in which something will be heard of Africa's contribution to the development of mankind. The African historical attitude will not be revengeful or self-satisfied, it will be a vital exercise of collective memory, clearing up the past so as to see its own origins. The brand image of Africa has been shaped by so many interesting external attitudes, right up to those of present-day films, that it is time to turn a new look on Africa, one from the inside, one of identity, authenticity, awakening, a volte rapatria, a return home. As Jacques Burke calls this return to the fountainhead. When one thinks of the power of the word and of names in Africa, and that to name someone is almost to take. 19. Methodology and African prehistory. Possession of him, so much so that people are revered fathers, husbands, kings are referred to by nicknames or paraphrases rather than by their names. One realizes why the whole series of words and concepts, all the panoply of stereotypes and mental patterns concerning African history, add up to the most subtle form of alienation. The real Copernican revolution is needed, the revolution which would be semantic in the first place, and which, without denying the demands of universal science, would take up the whole historical flow of Africa and guide it into new molds. 28 As J. Mackenzie observed as early as 1887, referring to the Tswana Botswana, many African peoples are known by names which neither they themselves nor any other African peoples have ever used. They have passed through the baptismal font of colonization, and emerged dedicated to alienation. The only road out of this is to write books about African history more and more in African languages. This presupposes other structural reforms. MENY books on African history generously accord a tenth of their pages to pre-colonial history, on the grounds that so little is known about it. With the result that they skip the so-called dark centuries and go straight to some famous explorer or proconsul, the providential demiurge or deus ex machina with WHOM. The real story supposedly begins, Africa's independent past being consigned to a sort of disreputable prehistory. So of course there is no question of denying the influxes from outside which have acted as an accelerating or detonating force. For example, the introduction of firearms into the Central Sudan in the 16th century gave the slave man infantry the advantage over the feudal horseman. This change had repercussions in the power structure throughout the Central Sudan, and the Kisela Kalkamar, originally recruited from slaves, supplanted the noble minister's aroma in his relations with the king. But mechanical explanations, based on external influences even in regard to headrests, and automatic parallels drawn between influxes from without and movements in African history, ought to be banished in favor of a more inward analysis which would aim at revealing endogenous contradictions and dynamisms. 29 Moreover, this history can only be the history of the peoples of the African continent as a whole, seen as a whole including the mainland and neighboring islands such as Madagascar, according to the definition in the OU Charter. The history of Africa obviously includes the Mediterranean. 28. An interesting example of this is furnished by I.A. Akinjadbin 1967. Starting from a comparison between the system of the EBI extended family, the presumed source of Oyo's authority over families, and the Dahomey system of adaptation to the slave trade through authoritarian monarchy exercised over individuals, the author explains the disparity between the two regimes. See also B. Berhagen, 1974, page 156. 29. CRC. C. LW, 1971. The HE author explains the decline of Oyo as due to internal tensions between social categories dependent on the governing power, slaves, the Atlapans, kings stewards in the provinces, provincial representatives at court and the triumvirate of royal eunuchs of the middle, right and left. 20. General Introduction. Sectoring the unity consecrated by age-long and sometimes bloody links, which make the two parts of Africa on either side of the Sahara the two leaves of one door, the two sides of one coin. It is necessarily a history of peoples, for even the despotism of certain dynasties has always been tempered in Africa by distance, by the absence of those technical means which add to the weight of centralization, and by the permanence of village democracies, so that at every level, from base to summit, the council called together through and for discussion constitutes the brain of the body politic. It must be a history of peoples because, except for a few decades in modern times, it has never been shaped according to the frontiers fixed by colonization, for the good reason that the territorial bases of the African peoples differ everywhere from the frontiers inherited from colonial partition. Take one example among many, the Senufo extend over part of Mali, part of the Ivory Coast, and part of Upper Volta. So in the continental context the emphasis should be on COMMON factors resulting from COMMON origins and age-long interregional exchanges of men, goods, techniques and ideas, in other words of both material and spiritual commodities. Ever since prehistory, despite natural obstacles and the low level of techniques, there has been a certain degree of historical solidarity on a continental scale, between the Nile Valley and the Sudan on the one hand and the Guinea Forest on the other, between the Nile Valley and East Africa, including among other things the dispersion of the Luo, between the Sudan and Central Africa, through the diaspora of the Bandit, and between the Atlantic and East Coasts, through transcontinental trade across Shab. Migration, which took place on a large scale in both space and time, is not to be seen as a vast human tide attracted by emptiness and leaving emptiness in its wake. Even the torrential saga of Shaka, the Amphicaine, cannot be interpreted only in such terms. The northward movement of the Musi group's upper Volta from Tagormba and Mampruzigan was executed by bands of horsemen who, although they occupied various regions at different stages, could do so only by amalgamating with the people they found there and taking wives locally. The judicial privileges they accorded themselves quickly resulted in the spread of facial scarification, which acted as a sort of identity card. The language and institutions of the newcomers prevailed to the point of ousting those of the other peoples, but other usages, such as those connected with agrarian religion or governing rights of settlement, remained within the province of local chiefs, and joking relations were established with some peoples encountered en route. The great Musi conqueror, Ubari, was himself a half-breed. This osmotic process should almost always be substituted for the romantic but oversimplified scenario of nihilistic and devastating invasion, which was how the eruption of the Penihilo into North Africa was long and wrongly represented. The general history of Africa is not a history of one race. The excesses of racially prejudiced physical anthropology are now rejected by all serious authors. But the Hamites and other brown races invented to fit the purpose. 21. Methodology and African prehistory are still to be found in the mirages and fantasies produced by otherwise scientific minds. Such categories, says J. Hyrnes in an important text, 30 cannot be admitted as biological units. The Fulani are a cultural, not a biological group. Those of South Cameroon, for example, have their closest biological relations in the Kea of Tanzania. As for the biological closeness between the Moors and the Warsingeli of Somalia, this derives no more from heredity than from the similar biotope-barren steppe which conditions both groups. Strictly biological factors have for thousands of years been constantly confused by selection and genetic drift, and supply no firm framework for classification, either in terms of blood groups or in terms of frequency of the HBS gene which determines abnormal hemoglobin and, in association with a normal gene, strengthens resistance to malaria. This illustrates the crucial role of adaptation to the natural setting. For example, higher stature and wider pelvis coincide with areas of great dryness and heat. The morphology of the narrow, high skull polycocephalic is an adaptation providing for reduction in the absorption of heat. So far as possible the word tribe will be banished from this book, except in the case of certain regions in North Africa. 31 because of its pejorative connotations and the many wrong ideas which underlie it. However much one may stress the fact that a tribe is a cultural and sometimes political unit, some people go on seeing it as a term for a stock which is biologically distinct, and make much of the horrors of the tribal wars, which often caused only a few dozen deaths, at most, while forgetting all the real exchanges which have linked the peoples of Africa on the biological, technological, cultural, religious and socio-political levels, and which lend African achievements an undoubted family air. Moreover, our history of Africa must avoid being too narrative, for otherwise it would be in danger of according too much importance to external factors and influences. Though of course, the establishment of key events is a task of the first importance, indispensable to the task of defining the original outline of African evolution. But the main concern will be with civilizations, institutions, structures, agrarian and metallurgical techniques, arts and crafts, trade networks, the conception and organization of power, religion and religious and philosophical thought, the problem of nations and 30. J. Hyrnes, 1970, pages 53-4. 31. The Arabic term Kabyle designates a group of persons linked genealogically to a an ancestor and living within a specific territory. Since genealogical filiation is of great importance among Semitic peoples, Arabs, Berbers, and so on, the Kabyle, the English equivalent of which would be tribe, has played and sometimes still plays a part not to be disregarded in the history of many North African countries. In order to preserve its full historical and socio-cultural connotation, the original word Kabylian will be retained. 22. General introduction, pre-nations, techniques of modernization, and so on. This methodological approach makes interdisciplinarity even more necessary. Finally, why this return to African sources? While for an outsider this quest for the past could be merely a way of satisfying curiosity, a highly stimulating intellectual exercise for someone eager to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, the real intention of our enterprise should go far beyond these purely individual aims. For the history of Africa is necessary to the understanding of world history, many passages of which will remain impenetrable enigmas as long as the historical horizon of the continent of Africa has not been lit up. Moreover, on the methodological plane, the compiling of a history of Africa according to the norms set out in this volume may furnish information on the validity of the approach advocated by the supporters of total history, history apprehended at all levels and in all dimensions and by means of all the tools of investigation available. History thus becomes a symphonic discipline in which all branches of learning are heard simultaneously, the combination at any particular moment varying according to the subject matter and the stage reached in research, so as to fit in with the necessities of communication. But the posthumous reconstruction of an edifice once built out of living stones is important above all to Africans themselves. They have a flesh and blood interest in it, and enter this area after centuries or decades of frustration, like an exile who discovers the contours of his longed-for homeland, contours that are at once both new and old, because they have been secretly looked forward to. To live without history is to be a wave, or to use the roots of others. It is to renounce the possibility of being oneself a root for those who come after. In the sea of evolution, it is to accept the anonymous role of protozoan or plankton. African statesmen should interest themselves in history as an essential part of the national heritage of which they are custodians, the more so as, through history, they can come to know other African countries than their own, in the context of African unity. But this history is even more necessary to the African peoples themselves, for whom it constitutes a fundamental right. Teams must be got together by the African states to save, before it is too late, as many historical remains as possible. Museums must be built and legislation passed for the protection of sites and objects. Grants and scholarships must be given, especially for the training of archaeologists. Syllabuses and degree courses need to be completely overhauled and given the properly African perspective. History is a source in which we should not only see and recognize our own reflection, but from which we should also drink and renew our strength, so as to forge ahead in the caravan of human progress. If such is the object of this history of Africa, the weary and difficult task will surely be a fruitful one, and a source of all kinds of inspiration. For somewhere beneath the ashes of the past there are embers instinct with the light of resurrection,